Episode 283, Elizabeth Vos.
Elizabeth Vos, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for being back on. I really do appreciate it. And want to talk to you today about a bunch of different topics ranging from Israel and Iran to the election to some other related issues. But before we get into that, I usually hold my patron questions until the end of the show, but I did have one that I thought we'd just start off with today. And for folks out there who would like to become a patron and join the conversation, submit questions to guests, you can do that at patreon.com/Primo Radical. Only costs $1 a month, and you can submit questions to all the guests. I had one patron question regarding your background. Just kind of wanted to know how you got involved in journalism, maybe where you're from, just kind of share a little bit about your own background.
Sure. Thank you. That's a great question. I grew up in Australia, moved to the US, have lived in the US most of my adult life. I'm now based in Arkansas, as life would have it. And basically around the time I was graduating with my undergraduate degree in English Lit, that's around the time that the 2016 election was unfolding. And I noticed the way that the media was reporting on, especially the WikiLeaks revelations, very dishonestly. And the beginnings of Russiagate were starting to come out, and I saw how dishonest that reporting seemed to be. And I just was really frustrated, and I thought, well, almost anybody could do better than this. If you have basic understanding of grammar, anybody could report more honestly than this. And so, I ended up basically starting a website with a couple of other disgruntled people and eventually I did some Assange activism. And as we started to write, people took us seriously, which we didn't really intend at the time. We weren't trying to become journalists. We were just writing because we felt like somebody should. And after that point, and some Assange activism with Unity4J, people like Susie Dawson, we were, very frustrated with the way that Assange was being treated in the embassy way back in 2018 when they originally cut off his internet and contact with the outside world. So through that, I linked up with Joe Laurie of Consortium News. We were co-hosting some of the Unity4J vigils at the time. And so I'm condensing like lots of years here, but eventually I started doing just freelance writing for Consortium News, for Mint Press News. I co-host Consortium News's webcast, CN Live, and that's kind of where I'm at. I'm a mother, and I'm doing journalism part-time, but I care about it very much.
So, of the journalism that you've been doing over the last several years, is there any particular piece or sort of investigations that you've done that you're particularly proud of?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think the Russiagate coverage, the coverage of the 2016 election and the rigging against Bernie Sanders by the DNC, and then their obfuscation of that through Russiagate allegations and criticizing things like the Goose for Two narrative. Those were my initial stories that I really worked on a lot. And then moving forward, I did some stories about various sex trafficking cases, whether it was the Dutroux case and the WikiLeaks revelations about that, through to some coverage of Jeffrey Epstein and other government-linked sex trafficking cases, especially surrounding children. I cared about those. I care about those stories a lot too. And then, yeah, recently, some coverage of Gaza, which I'm not an expert in Middle East geopolitics, but obviously, I think everyone, cares about that subject deeply, given the fact that it's a genocide happening in front of us, live streamed for over a year is shocking. So, yeah, I think I've done some coverage of that and coverage of the election, this current election cycle as well.
Well, you mentioned Assange, and obviously that was a saga that went on for years where he was holed up in the embassy, then he was taken out of the embassy, seemingly against international law, and then was at Belmarsh for several years until he finally won his freedom this year after having to plead guilty on one count. So just curious if you kind of share your thoughts overall on the Assange case, how he was able to gain his freedom. And I know recently he made some remarks and also was recognized for his journalism. So if you just kind of share overall, the last few years in Julian Assange's life.
I mean, he was so I think he spent about 5 years in Belmarsh, which is, the UK's equivalent of Guantanamo Bay, is what some people call it, which is extremely, maximum security prison, very harsh circumstances. I believe he had to um, stack books in a window at one point during the winter to keep warm because they were not heating the prison well enough and he wasn't given proper clothing and that sort of thing. So very harsh conditions. But the way that it happened is that UK lawyers for the prosecution told their compatriots in the US that they were going to lose the case, that they would lose, and that at this point, Assange had already served 5 years in Belmarsh, which is what he would have likely served, they said, in the US. And so basically, he would potentially get time served. And they did not want to face a complete loss, where Assange would be totally vindicated. At the same time, Assange did not want to spend, who knows how much more time in very harsh conditions in Belmarsh while various proceedings would play out, maybe for years before he would ultimately be vindicated. And he was having health issues. We don't know what his health would have been like at the end of those proceedings. So an agreement was reached where Assange would basically plead guilty to journalism, one count under the Espionage Act, where he admitted that he sought and received classified information from a source. As he said when he was being sentenced, when the plea agreement was finalized in the Mariana Islands, I believe, he basically said, "I plead guilty to doing journalism," essentially. So at that point, I believe it was June 24th is when we got the news that he was going to be free and that plea agreement had been reached. And so since that point, he's, been he's been getting into his new life in Australia with his wife Stella and his children. He's been recovering there. And we didn't hear anything from Assange for a long time. And there was a lot of debate amongst activists and supporters who had been, working really, really hard in the way that they were capable of to try to get Assange free, pardoned, and vindicated. A lot of people were frustrated or concerned that, as to what his health status was. Was he ever going to speak publicly again, etc. And you could see a lot of debate about that on social media going back and forth. And so sort of out of the blue, it became public that Assange, about a week before it happened, Assange announced that Assange, family announced that he would be speaking at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, called PACE, because there was a report that had been submitted to PACE by one of its members that was in regards to him being a political prisoner in the UK, especially in the UK during his imprisonment during this whole ordeal. So he attended that. He flew all the way to France, to Strasbourg, and he presented a speech there. He took questions and answers. And the next day, the PACE they voted and they did find him to be a political prisoner.
My naivete was believing in the law. When push comes to shove, laws are just pieces of paper, and they can be reinterpreted for political expediency. They are the rules made by the ruling class, more broadly, and if those rules don't suit what it wants to do, it reinterprets them, or hopefully changes them, which is clearer. In the case of the United States, we angered one of the constituent powers of the United States, the intelligence sector, the security state, the secrecy state. It was powerful enough to push for a reinterpretation of the US Constitution. The US First Amendment seems pretty black and white to me. It's very short. It says the Congress shall make no law restricting speech or the press. However, that was that the U.S. Constitution, those precedents relating to it, were just reinterpreted away.
So that was a huge development, both in terms of Assange speaking out for the first time publicly, and also in terms of the political ramifications of that. That a body like that, I think Assange referred to it in the speech as a norm-setting body would make that decision. So.
Why do you think that the United States accepted this plea deal? I mean, they had been really persecuting him for years, and then just seemingly, all of a sudden they decided to let him go by pleading guilty to this one charge. So why would you guess that happened?
Well, I think a lot of people, obviously activism for Assange made a difference in terms of the political ramifications of keeping him in Belmarsh and or extraditing him. I think the intelligence community and the interests in the US power structure that hated Assange would never have given up the possibility of getting him into the US and into the prison system in the US. I think they really wanted that. So I don't think it was activism alone that made that difference. I do think it made it politically uncomfortable for the Biden administration to continue trying to prosecute Assange, but it wasn't unbearable. I think what finally tipped the scales was the UK lawyers basically threatening mutiny. They told in the email that they sent to their US counterparts, they basically said that they would have to stop, they'd have to like resign their posts essentially, because they couldn't go forward arguing that the US had made these assurances that it really couldn't make. Because the final issue was that the US could not promise that Assange would not be denied First Amendment protections on the basis of his nationality. And there's really no way they could make an assurance that he would not be denied that, because the executive branch cannot make decisions that or pronouncements that a judge has to make in their discretion, number one. And number two, it was very clear that the prosecution in the US would argue that he shouldn't have First Amendment protections. As a journalist, that was openly part of the prosecution's efforts in the US. So, it just came to a brick wall. There was no way that they could proceed with that. So, if they had, the UK lawyers either would have resigned, I think is the terminology they used, or they would have just lost eventually.
Well, I wanted to ask you also about something related, and that is censorship overall and online censorship. Because, since you started journalism and I started this show 9 years ago, there was increasing censorship year after year, where I think it was in 2018, there was a bunch of deplatformings and channels getting demonetized. Then, after, during COVID and all of the skepticism around the vaccine, also the 2020 election and Donald Trump's claims that the election had been stolen or rigged. That was completely scrubbed for a while. I actually had an interview where I read a patron question to Cynthia McKinney, and that whole interview got taken down because of a patron question. But since 2021, 2022, it's been more in the conversation. There was this proposed department of was it part of the DHS where they were going to have a disinformation czar, and that got a lot of publicity and then was seemingly scrubbed. And then we also had Elon Musk purchasing Twitter and rebranding as X, him claiming that was for free speech reasons. We saw a lot of content creators move over to Rumble, and Rumble has become sort of like a conservative version of YouTube in some sense, where there's a lot of creators on there and a lot of content on there that just isn't allowed on YouTube. So, I'm just wondering overall how you see the state of censorship today, because again, it's become much more of a focal point. It also was in the vice presidential debate recently, where they had asked J.D. Vance if the 2020 election was rigged, and he started talking about how conservative thought had been scrubbed from social media platforms.
I believe that we actually do have a threat to democracy in this country, but unfortunately, it's not the threat to democracy that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz want to talk about. It is the threat of censorship. It's Americans casting aside lifelong friendships because of disagreements over politics. It's big technology companies silencing their fellow citizens. And it's Kamala Harris saying that rather than debate and persuade her fellow Americans, she'd like to censor people who engage in misinformation. I think that is a much bigger threat to democracy than anything that we've seen in this country in the last 4 years, in the last 40 years. Now, I'm really proud, especially given that I was raised by two lifelong blue-collar Democrats, to have the endorsement of Bobby Kennedy Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, lifelong leaders in the Democratic coalition. And of course, they don't agree with me and Donald Trump on every issue. We don't have to agree on every issue, but we're united behind a basic American First Amendment principle that we ought to debate our differences. We ought to argue about them. We ought to try to persuade our fellow Americans. Kamala Harris is engaged in censorship at an industrial scale. She did it during COVID. She's done it over a number of other issues. And that, to me, is a much bigger threat to democracy than what Donald Trump said when he said that protesters should peacefully protest on January the 6th.
So it's definitely much more in the popular conversation, especially, among Republicans and conservatives, but also, it's been a focal point for folks in the anti-imperialist left for years who've also been getting demonetized and deplatformed. But again, it seems to be much more of a focal point now. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the state of censorship now that it is, a very hot topic. It's not something that's just sort of happening to these sort of fringe accounts or people like Alex Jones, who, has been, really demonized. What do you think is the state of censorship now? Have things gotten any better?
Definitely not better. I think that what I'm noticing over time, now that I've watched it for a few years, is that it seems to fluctuate heavily depending on what part of the election cycle we're in. So I noticed, for example, that there was some interesting censorship happening right during the DNC convention. There was an uptick also. I mean, obviously, back in 2020, right before the election, we had that Hunter Biden story come out, and there was a huge amount of censorship of that story, even though it turned out to be true. And it was called Russian disinformation and all the rest. And I see that now, prior to this upcoming very close election this year, I think that I'm seeing more censorship on Meta platforms, to an extent on Twitter, but more of YouTube, Meta, the standard social media platforms. I don't see it getting better anytime soon. I think it's probably progressively going to continue to get worse. But as I said, kind of more in waves than a clampdown that just continues. It seems to let up a little bit. Like, for example, I know that there were some really good YouTube creators that did get censored recently, and then they let them back on the platform after there was some protest, some uproar about it. So it seems to come and go, but I see it progressively going downhill, unfortunately.
Well, again, just it seems as though in the case of Rumble, for example, and I guess you could say with X also, because there was censorship happening on Facebook and YouTube, it kind of maybe pushed some people over or, created a new platform for folks who may not have had a platform before. So just again, in the example of like those, or like the trend of there being alternatives that pop up to, provide a platform for folks who are getting censored off of the main social media networks, do you think that, that maybe causes them to not censor as much? Because again, it's YouTube has effectively created a competitor to them. They've said, okay, you guys aren't all out on here, and everybody's, moved over to Rumble, and now they have their own platform. And they've created like effectively a competitor to YouTube. So just what are your thoughts on that trend of sort of pushing people onto new platforms?
Yeah, I think that's a trend that will continue. It is interesting that, especially like on YouTube, you'll see a lot of times people like Glenn Greenwald and other creators will say, here's the 10 minutes I'll give you on YouTube. Now, if you want to see the rest of the stuff that would otherwise be censored, you have to go to my Rumble channel and stuff like that. I think that's going to continue. And I think it's an effective strategy to fight against the censorship. You still have your YouTube audience. You still have an on-ramp point into those alternative social media platforms. TikTok is a good example of one of those competitors, like you were saying, where the mainstream platforms are almost creating the void that those competitors will fill. TikTok was a great example. And instead of competing in the marketplace of ideas with something like TikTok, you saw a huge backlash against the platform itself. I hope that doesn't spread to platforms like Rumble. I think that ultimately the really big platforms, the Meta platforms, YouTube. The way that I see it is that they value their role as censors and as dictators of what the social discourse will be, like determiners of the Overton window of what's acceptable to talk about. I think they value that more than profit ultimately. And so I don't think that they're going to stop with the censorship just because a viable competitor rises up. I think that instead they'll just try to, either with lobbying efforts through the government or whatnot, that I think they'll try in whatever way they can to just eradicate their competitors if they're able to.
Hey Radicals, I hope that you're all enjoying this interview. As you know, this is the start of my spectacular 10th season. This is going to be a big one. We have lots of big returning guests, lots of new guests as well. So really want to make sure that it's great. Please do help support the show if at all possible. You can do that in a few different ways. You can like, comment, and subscribe. Follow me across all different social media networks. And also, if at all possible, please do consider financially supporting the show. You can do that at patreon.com/Primo Radical. When you become a patron, you can submit questions to all of my guests, so please do consider that. That's only $1 a month. Please also consider sending super chats and super thanks, and make sure again that you're just following me across all different social media networks. Thanks again, folks, for the last 9 years of support, and again, I'm looking forward to making this a great 10th season. I did want to move on to the 2024 election, and obviously there's just so much that we could talk about. It's an interesting convergence of sort of historical things happening where we have Donald Trump seeking to win back the White House, and no president has had 2 non-consecutive terms since Grover Cleveland. No president has even tried to run again since Teddy Roosevelt. And we had Joe Biden stepping down. Some would say he was forced out, and I've been kind of vocal about that, about the strange timing of the first debate that he had with Trump, why they did that in June, right between the end of the primaries, but before the conventions. The assassination attempts as well. We still don't really have many answers about what happened with the first assassination attempt. Ryan Routh, who was arrested and being prosecuted for an assassination attempt, he had a very strange background of going to Ukraine. So it's just been a very odd election overall. So yeah, I guess I just would be interested to know sort of your general thoughts on how you kind of see the election currently, and then obviously the last week or two we've been kind of seeing things trend in favor of Donald Trump on Polymarket. It's a betting website where people can bet on the outcome of the election. He's the favorite at this point. It's about a 60-40 split. We've been seeing a lot of polls coming out of Pennsylvania, for example, which is a must-win for Kamala Harris, where Donald Trump seems to be pulling ahead, if not in other states. Some folks think that because of the polling error that we saw in 2016 and in 2020, which underestimated Trump, that if we saw those same polling errors, this could be a complete historic blowout for Donald Trump. So just kind of curious on your thoughts about that, if you think it's likely, and just overall what your thoughts are on the election.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to make a bet one way or the other. I think that Trump is definitely trending upwards right now, and I think the honeymoon period for Kamala Harris is over. I want to go back to what you said about the timing with Joe Biden and the debate. I also thought that was very odd, the timing of the debate with Trump, and the fact that Biden could have stepped down in terms of being a presidential candidate at any point. He did so late, like with just like a few months left before the election, that there could be no primary process in the Democratic Party. I mean, it was very unfortunate timing, to say the least. So I thought that was all a series of very interesting developments. I thought that it definitely didn't seem from the outside looking in like he did that. He was really willing to go. I think he probably held on to the very end until he was basically forced out from the looks of it.
Yeah, I mean, he was saying for weeks that he was not going to step down. And then just a few days, I believe, after the first Trump assassination attempt, he had these meetings with Pelosi and Schumer, and was getting calls from Obama. So I don't know, again, conspiracy theories are they were threatening him with maybe the 25th Amendment, that they were just going to remove him from office. But, it definitely did not seem as though it was something that he really wanted to do.
Yeah, and I thought the way that Kamala, overly praises him at every opportunity, it does read a little bit as maybe, she speaks too much, so to speak. I also thought that Kamala Harris, her unwillingness to put forward policy decisions until the 12th hour is not helping her. I don't think the policies that she has put forward recently, especially, are not, I don't think that they're attractive to the left. It seems to me that Kamala Harris and her campaign is very overtly and brazenly abandoning the left and openly courting the right. I mean, she's not only is she receiving the endorsements of like hundreds of Republicans and people like Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney, she's also bragging about it. I mean, she's not just kind of embarrassed by it. She's embracing it. So I think she's speaking well, this will be past tense, but speaking with Bret Baier on Fox News, things like that. She's really trying to convert Republicans to her cause, it seems, rather than putting forth policies that would appeal to her left-wing base. And I think it's also concerning to me that we're seeing almost a revisit to 2016, where instead of appealing to the progressive left, she's simply vote shaming them. She's basically saying you're a crypto Trump supporter if you're on the left and you refuse to vote Harris. And so instead of making attractive policies, it's just more of the same vote shaming. We literally saw the same thing with Hillary Clinton in 2016. So I think they should know better. They should know that that's not a winning strategy. It's lost for them before. But just like in 2016, I doubt that there will be any sort of self-reflection, insight, or awareness that it's their own fault should they lose. And I don't know that they will. We haven't really seen an October surprise yet. I don't know if there will be one. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of developments going on internationally that obviously could have an impact on the election. Recently, there was the Biden administration threatened this arms embargo against Israel if they don't let aid into northern Gaza. Now, I think that's an election time ploy. I think it's political theater. I don't think it's legitimate, especially because their threatened embargo doesn't happen until after the election were to take place. But I think it does indicate that they are trying, the Biden administration is attempting to at least look like they care about what's going on in Gaza, even though they're not stopping military aid to Israel. They're continuing at this moment to send arms and even troops to Israel. They're sending 100 troops right now to help them as the tensions rise with Iran. So yeah.
Well, yeah, I do want to touch on that, but just to go back to the election for a second, you know, it is kind of a funny dichotomy that we're seeing because we are seeing Kamala Harris and the Democrats continue with the trend that we've really seen over the last, 8 to 10 years, where they're embracing neoconservatism. They're embracing the endorsements of Dick Cheney and Alberto Gonzalez. And, again, like you're saying, really courting Republicans and not really providing any real, left-wing social democratic sort of policies. I think really what it boils down to is neoconservatism, but with identity politics, basically. And it's an unfortunate trend that we've been seeing where all of these Bush era neoconservatives, they're finding a home in the Democratic Party now. And if you object to that and you want to vote for someone like Jill Stein, who's actually on the left, you're called a Republican. So it's this very weird sort of doublethink that's being exhibited where you're seeing this, blue-brown alliance, this, Democrats and neocon fascists joining hands. But if you support Jill Stein or just say you are opposed to genocide and the genocide that the Biden administration is facilitating, then you must be a right winger. So it's just a very odd sort of doublethink.
Definitely, the cognitive dissonance of that is huge. Both we love the Republicans, but also you are a Republican and worse than Hitler if you don't vote for us at the same time. Ridiculous.
Yeah, and again, it's just unfortunate, and it's very strange how much they've been demonizing Jill Stein recently. Honestly, the Democratic line of attack has just been seemingly all over the place lately. They were really hung up on J6 for a while, and then there was this whole narrative around Trump sending COVID tests to Putin. Lately, they've been saying Trump is mentally ill because he had played some music at a rally. But for a day or two, there was a heavy focus on Jill Stein, and there was this new commercial that the Democrats actually put out against Jill Stein, which is a historic thing. They never targeted a third-party candidate before.
Jill Stein, Green Party candidate for president. So why are Trump's close allies helping her? Stein was key to Trump's 2016 wins in battleground states. She's not sorry she helped Trump win. That's why a vote for Stein is really a vote for Trump.
Jill Stein, I like her very much. You know why? She takes 100% from them.
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message.
Obviously, Jill Stein is polling very well with younger voters and with Muslim Americans in the swing states. Michigan is a big one. There's a heavy Muslim American population there, and there's polling suggesting that 20-30% of those voters could go to Jill Stein. So but it seems as though, in my mind too, just based on the fact that we're seeing things trend in Trump's favor overall, that Jill Stein is going to be the scapegoat. So they're setting that up. They're saying it's her fault, probably regardless of how big the margin is going to end up being.
Definitely. It's definitely some future proofing. I think it's definitely serving two purposes, like you're suggesting. One being, should they lose, then they're setting up Jill Stein to be a massive scapegoat for them, which to an extent she was in 2016 as well. It's the same thing playing out again. But also I agree that the way in which Jill Stein is polling right now threatens them to the degree that they think it's worth spending money on a campaign ad, showing Jill Stein's face morphing into Trump in order to attack her. Yeah, it's very interesting to watch. And I think that, again, it's interesting as well because I don't think you would see this level of or this degree of threat from Jill Stein, obviously, if we weren't seeing what's going on in Gaza. If there wasn't a genocide going on that the Democrats just gloss over and want to ignore, or give a few words to in terms of the suffering of Palestinian civilians before going on to promise that they'll never put any limits on Israel and its right to what they call its right to defend itself. So they have to have somebody to blame rather than their own policy decisions. So Jill Stein is that person because she's the only one who's saying, as a presidential candidate, I'm against this genocide. So they have to demonize her. They're really stuck between a rock and a hard place because there's no way that they can, the Harris campaign, the Democratic Party, that they can make a policy decision against the genocide while keeping their AIPAC lobbyist donors and the huge support that they have from American, liberal Zionists.
Yeah, it's a strange thing to see Senator Fetterman. He's actually been going after AOC on X because he's such a vocal Zionist. So there is, we've seen the AIPAC go after members of the squad as well, primary them. So there's definitely a push to get rid of any dissent within the Democratic Party. And this is probably the one issue where there is even a tinge of dissent because we've just seen again this push to effectively turn Democrats into a modern day neoconservative party, especially in the case of Russia and Ukraine. There wasn't really any dissent among the squad or Bernie Sanders or anyone else there. But yeah, this just going back to the this shaming, it's so ridiculous. It's so, again, unfortunate, and the fact also that they're suing to keep Jill Stein off of state ballots. That's a whole nother dynamic to this, where they say that they're standing up for democracy and Trump's a threat to democracy. Meanwhile, they're trying to push Jill Stein off of state ballots, and they're trying to shame people out of voting for her. And it doesn't even really logically make sense as far as like the whole spoiler narrative too, in my mind, because Democrats claim somehow that they effectively own those Green Party votes, which are only about 1% of people who vote, right? And instead of going after everyone who doesn't vote or any other third party candidates, they go after the Green Party and try to shame them. But by the same logic, couldn't the Republicans just claim all of the libertarian votes and thereby offset or even imaginary sort of increase their own margin. Like it just again, the whole thing is sort of nonsensical and just sort of repugnant.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And of course there's a huge percentage of people that don't vote. And going back to the how important the Gaza and Palestinian genocide is, they are ignoring the fact that I think it's something, my numbers may be a little off here, but as far as even back in June, I think it was that some polling was done that showed that I think it was over 60% of likely American voters wanted a ceasefire. And then 77% of likely Democrat voters wanted a ceasefire. So to ignore that huge of a majority of your own base, it is ridiculous, really.
But again, they believe in democracy.
Right. Yeah, they definitely believe in representing their constituents and the people that vote for them. And they definitely want to uphold all of democratic values for sure. So.
Well, just, did want to also talk about Israel and Gaza today, and just the fact that this war, this genocide has been expanding over the past year now. Obviously we just saw, the continual bombing of Gaza and the attacks on the civilian population for the past year. But we've also seen Israel expanding the war where they started attacking Lebanon and invading Lebanon. And then also there was the assassination that took place in Iran right around the inauguration of their new president there. And, we had them sort of exchanging where Iran was bombing Israel, and then we had these pager attacks and everything else. So we also had Israel bombing Syria, and I believe even bombing a Russian air base in Syria. So we've just seen this sort of growing over time, where we're seemingly on the precipice of World War III, where Israel could attack Iran any day now, and conceivably the U.S. would be involved in that, providing some kind of logistics or intelligence to facilitate that attack. So do you think that that's really where things might be going? Like, do you foresee this being a major regional war, or do you see any sort of off-ramp here?
Well, I hope it's not. I very much hope that de-escalation is possible, but it doesn't, based on Israel's actions over the last year and especially the last few months, I don't see that being likely. It does appear to me that should Israel attack Iran, and if they escalate things into a full-blown war with Iran, that the US is fully prepared to back Israel. Right now, we're sending them air defense arms. We're also sending, as I mentioned earlier, 100 troops to Israel to help them if should they escalate with Iran. So it seems to me that Israel can really do no wrong, that they're willing to attack UN peacekeepers. They're willing to obviously attack civilians in Gaza nonstop, in schools, in refugee camps, in hospital courtyards. There's no amount of carnage that gets live streamed to the entire world that will slow them down, it seems like, and no amount of breaking of international law that concerns them whatsoever. Anytime they breach a law or something like, attacking the UN, they always seem to turn it around as if they are the victimized party. They'll call the UN anti-Semitic. They'll do whatever. They just don't ever seem fazed by the consequences of their actions. So I don't see Israel de-escalating, and I don't see the U.S. Stopping its support of Israel. And that's another reason that I think that the threatened arms embargo by the Biden administration is purely political theater, because if we actually cared about getting aid into Gaza in significantly increased amounts, we would be putting out an arms embargo right now and not sending U.S. troops there right now. So.
Well, one claim that you often hear from Democrats, especially folks who say, I'm going to vote for Jill Stein, is that, Trump is going to do all of this but worse. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. Do you think that is the case? Because in terms of rhetoric, at least, it seems as though the Trump and Republican team, they're less hawkish on Ukraine and Russia, right? They're talking about having a ceasefire, and Trump's actually saying, I think before he even takes office, there'll be some kind of peace deal. But he's very supportive of Israel. He constantly says that he was, the Israel's best friend ever in the White House. Um, and all this rhetoric around Iran, and that was actually also a part of the assassination attempts as well, because they were trying to tie things to Iran, and they had these other alleged assassination plots that the FBI basically cooked up that they were blaming on Iran. And I think recently there was talks about Trump asking for missiles and whatnot to defend his plane in case there's an Iranian attack on him. So again, the Republicans seem, at least in rhetoric, to be much more hawkish against Iran and much friendlier towards Israel. Do you think that all of that is just theater? Again, just because it almost seems as though, if we were to take it all seriously, that Trump and the Republicans sort of want to end the Ukraine war to shift more focus to the Middle East, whereas Democrats may be in some ways more reluctant to support Israel, I guess, more dragging their feet or doing this sort of theater, but are obviously much more hawkish against Russia. So I'm just wondering what your overall take is on that.
Yeah, I think it's hard to be more enthusiastic in terms of military support for Israel. It's hard to fathom what that would look like, given the fact that we've sent $17.9 billion in military aid to Israel in the year since October 7th, 2023. And given the fact that, Blinken was willing to basically lie to Congress about the reality of Israel denying aid to Gazans in order to ensure that arms kept flowing to Israel. So if you have an administration that is that enthralled to Israel, I cannot fathom what an even more pro-Zionist administration could look like under Trump. I'm not saying it couldn't be worse, but it seems like we're already seeing what a completely pro-Zionist administration looks like. But as far as what Trump has said, yes, I mean he's basically tried to differentiate himself by saying that Biden and the Biden administration is not supportive enough of Israel. I think it is interesting to see the neocon war hawks back Kamala Harris. I think probably in part because of Trump's hesitation on the war in Ukraine and his willingness to speak out against it. I think
because
that
the neocons were the architects of that as well. They were involved in
right.
the Orange Revolution. They were, they're the ones who effectively annexed Ukraine and Georgia for NATO. John McCain participated in the Maidan coup. So neocons really, again, they were the architects of that whole fiasco. And you can even go back to the 2012 election when Obama and the Democrats ran against Mitt Romney, saying that he was too hawkish on Russia and that he was exhibiting a Cold War mentality. So again, it kind of it makes sense there where you're going to see neocon support Harris just for the sake of opposing Russia.
Exactly. And so I think they're also probably thinking that, kind of as I'm alluding to, that regardless, it's going to be a pro-Zionist government, no matter who wins. And so they don't want to lose their war in Ukraine. Uh, I do think it's if Trump wins, I do think that there would be zero hesitation to support Israel should it war with Iran. So I think, but I really don't see much hesitation in real terms, in material terms, from the Biden administration to enact the same support. I just think that they tend to use different language about it. They'll tell the press that they're concerned, or that Israel's responses should be proportionate, or on and on, and they'll leak information about Biden being angry with Netanyahu, things like that, to make it look like there's some type of conflict. That they'll talk about working around the clock for a ceasefire when we don't see a ceasefire ever materialize. So I really think the only material difference would be the rhetoric that we see coming from the White House. I think that's honestly about it. Again, I cannot fathom how, in material terms, Trump could increase military aid to Israel over what we're already seeing. Especially, but I do think he would have zero concern about the suffering of civilians in Gaza. I don't see him having any concern about that, or anyone in his potential administration. People like RFK Jr., are extreme Zionists in their outlook. So I don't see any hope in terms of that. Like I would never, obviously, I would not say that Harris or Trump are what's the word, acceptable candidates to support on that front at all. And so I'm not going to be happy with either one winning. As far as from my perspective, it's not going to be a benefit to the world either way. But I think that it's valid that the protests and the repulsion that voters feel towards voting for either of them is totally valid, in other words. So.
Well, again, at the end of the day, I think the major challenge that we face in the U.S. politically, on at least this front of Israel and Gaza, is AIPAC and the influence of AIPAC money. Again, we've seen this involved in getting members of the squad primaried, just sort of stifling any sort of dissent. And this is really an organization that donates to both parties heavily, and the majority of members of Congress receive AIPAC money. And it's also odd when you watch social media how there'll be some event that takes place, and then all of these politicians put out seemingly the exact same tweet as though AIPAC just handed it to their team to tweet out. We've had Thomas Massey say things like every Congress member besides him, or most Congress members, have an AIPAC person who they meet with regularly.
And I have Republicans who come to me and say, that's wrong what AIPAC is doing to you. Let me talk to my AIPAC person. By the way, everybody but me has an AIPAC person.
What does that mean, an AIPAC person?
It's like your babysitter, your AIPAC babysitter, who is always talking to you for AIPAC. They're probably a constituent in your district, but they are, firmly embedded in AIPAC. And
every member has something like this?
I don't know how it works on the Democrat side, but that's how it works on the Republican side. And when they come to DC, you go have lunch with them, and they've got your cell number, and you have conversations with them. So I've had
that's absolutely crazy.
I've had 4 members of Congress say, I'll talk to my AIPAC person. And it's literally what we call them, my AIPAC guy. I'll talk to my AIPAC guy and see if I can get him to, dial those ads back.
Why have I never heard this before?
It doesn't benefit anybody. Why would they want to tell their constituents that they've basically got a buddy system with somebody who's representing a foreign country? It doesn't benefit the congressman for people to know that, so they're not going to tell you that.
So just kind of curious what your thoughts are on how to counter that. It almost seems as though we need, a PAC to donate to folks who are, anti-imperialist, or, on behalf of, the civilian populations that are getting slaughtered in places like Gaza, for example. I mean, is that realistic in your mind, or just how do we counter the influence of AIPAC?
I think maybe in another generation it might be feasible. I think that there are too many people in of the generations that don't see the carnage live streamed on the various social media platforms because they don't use them, and they're just watching corporate media, and they're brainwashed by Zionist talking points. I think that population is large enough that it would not be politically feasible to do something like that, as amazing as it would be. I think in another generation, when the generation that's currently watching this genocide unfold live is older and has a greater voter share of the total population, I think that would actually be possible potentially. I think as well, though, that just talking about the AIPAC and the Zionist lobby, that's exactly why the Democrats are choosing to court Republicans instead of their own base. That's exactly why, because they are totally unwilling to even remotely, even in the smallest ways, stand up to that lobby.
I know. And basically, they could really just be handing Trump the election because they refuse to oppose genocide.
Exactly. That's the sum up of it. I also think that, not to go into a conspiratorial realm too much, but it's also worth pointing out that people like Jeffrey Epstein were reported to have been working with Israeli intelligence, and I think that type of, in addition to lobbying, I think it's like there's a carrot and the stick. There's the lobbying aspect and the funding of campaigns. There's also the, the issue of blackmail, I think, in a lot of cases is significant in terms of influencing. I mean, I'm not saying anyone in particular, but just the political class in general. So.
Yeah, again, just going back to the generational shifts, that you were mentioning. It is funny looking at the polling because there is such disparity among generations. The most Zionist Americans are the silent generation, like people in their 80s and 90s, and then it kind of moves down gradually where millennials and Zoomers are more skeptical of that corporate media propaganda. And I think it goes to, like you said, the fact that they are they're not watching mainstream corporate media. But I have to wonder too, just how media itself is going to change and evolve, and how we're going to see sort of this gaslighting and these sort of limited hangouts and these psyops sort of evolve. And I think honestly we're seeing that sort of with Elon Musk and with the Trump campaign, and maybe some degree with like this whole push towards free speech that we're talking about earlier with platforms like Rumble. It seems as though that's just a whole nother form of marketing to say, oh, we are the free speech platforms, or we're the populists or whatever, but still just sell them the whole the same policy just with a different spin on it.
Absolutely, yeah. Just like you were saying earlier that the Harris campaign, the Democratic Party is becoming a neoconservative party with LGBTQ plus friendly veneer. I think in the same way you could see the conservatives become advocates for something like free speech, but completely devoid of actual real free speech. You definitely see that on Twitter. You see people still censored on Twitter all day long. It's just under a less, so to speak, woke banner, and so conservatives are more happy with it. So yeah, I think we're coming to a point where it really is going to be basically a uniparty, and the only difference materially is, well, there is no difference materially, but the only difference will be the culture war veneer on each party, and that we're already seeing that. I just think that it's going to get worse. Yeah. So.
Yeah. I mean, that's what they want us voting about, right? It's about, guns and abortion and trans issues. It's not really about U.S. foreign policy.
Right. Exactly. Anything but that. I think in terms of the generational changes, I think that it is really interesting to watch that change, that social media has had such a big impact on the way that people are perceiving what's going on in the world. And I don't think, and this is where I think Israel is ultimately will lose the war of public opinion. It may take longer than the war, it may take longer than it will take the genocide in Gaza to play out. I think, but ultimately Israel will lose the historical narrative. They're already losing it, but ultimately they will lose it completely, I think. And I think that they already know that, and that's why they don't care what they look like anymore to the rest of the world. Before, prior to a year ago, even on the left, Israel wasn't a hot topic. Gaza and Palestine wasn't I mean, it was definitely a huge topic amongst activists and activism. But in terms of the wider US discourse in politics, I don't think it was a front and center issue. The AIPAC lobby was not a front and center issue. And if you did speak about it, then you were considered to be kind of fringe. But the atrocities and the carnage that Israel is perpetrating against Palestinians right now has made it a front and center issue, specifically because obviously the US is supporting them and enabling it. But they have made themselves a moral pariah, and I don't think there's any coming back from that. And as the generations move forward, that's only going to become more the case. And genuinely, I don't know how they can recover from that on the international stage. Also, you see, even right now, as tensions do increase with Iran, you see Israelis, that many of whom are dual citizens, are fleeing to the countries in which they have dual citizenship, or they're fleeing in general. I don't know how much longer Israel can withstand that. honestly. So I think that's another interesting development. And it maybe that makes them more desperate and more willing to escalate to a dangerous degree, because they have to win now if they're going to win. They won't be able to win in 10 or 20 years.
Well, Elizabeth Vos, I really do appreciate you being on the show today and going through all of these issues. For folks out there who would like to follow you and support you, how can they do that?
You can find me on Twitter at Elizabeth, Leavos, and you can follow my work at Consortium News and Mint Press News, and I appreciate the conversation so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on today. I really do appreciate it, and hopefully I can have you back on sometime soon.
Thank you.